Okay, I promise I will be very brief. I wanted to actually begin with something that I didn't put on these slides that just came to mind when I was listening to the Q&A from the last session, which is that especially well, a lot of the questions in the last session were about advocacy. Translational work, and then also about the practical difficulties of studying marginalized populations in general and people who are coming out of prison in particular. And one thing I wanted to mention is that I was struck by the contrast between some of the things that Megan talked about yesterday when it comes to finding people and how everybody said it would be very difficult, but actually it wasn't that difficult in high incarceration areas. And from my own experiences doing qualitative work with small numbers, but with people returning from prison, is that the contrast in my mind is somehow like in the qualitative and ethnographic work, it seems like people are having more success finding and sustaining contact with the populations that we care about. But maybe when you try to scale it up, it becomes more difficult. I know in my own work, keeping in touch with people was not really much of an issue. They were eager to talk to us and would often tell us things that we compared what they told us to what they told their probation officers or their parole officers, and we saw that there was a lot that we knew that they didn't. So in part, it may be that there's a certain bond of trust that develops that's difficult to sustain when you scale things up. But those are just my thoughts. The other thought I wanted to throw out there was about what can we do, and it just occurred to me that more and more funding agencies either require or really want partnerships between academics and community providers, and I think that it's incumbent on both sides to kind of approach the other to be entrepreneurial about that and to find opportunities where you can write a proposal that would cover both purposes. And I think that's probably, I mean, it's hard to get funding these days, but it might be easier if you have that kind of a partnership. So yesterday I closed by talking about framing of the question, issues of causality, and also a little bit about policy and advocacy. Today I thought that I would focus on what we've discussed and what there's still left is to discuss about understanding the mechanisms through which the effects that this conference is centrally concerned about of incarceration may operate, and what's been said and what I think needs still to be said more. So here's the list of the things that we have discussed, and I think some of these are critically important. So in terms of the health of the incarcerated, and I'm kind of going through this somewhat by presenter, but I'm not going to slow things down by mentioning who said what. But looking at cause of death, looking at substances contributing to death, looking at other aspects of the process of reintegration, like Ingrid mentioned this categorization, transitional challenges, cognitive responses to those challenges, emotional responses to those challenges, and then how it manifests in different types of health behaviors and health outcomes. Issues of continuity of care, and I'm going to have a real problem pronouncing this word, but pharmacotherapy, how do you pronounce that word? Is that right? Okay. Triggers for substance use relapse are critically important to study. The disruption or maybe the continuity of social networks after incarceration, and the same with what Maria called primary partnerships or romantic relationships, and how they may be disrupted, and how it may lead to the introduction of multiple partners and perhaps more risky partners. The duration of incarceration as a mechanism, which is a very tricky one to study because of a lot of selection issues. The risk of disease transmission, the imposition of fines, fees, and legal restrictions on people either as a result of felony convictions or incarceration. So that's one big bin of issues and mechanisms, and I think that those are all really critically important pathways. And then we also have a lot on the side of studying the mechanisms for understanding the effects of incarceration on not the people who were incarcerated exactly, but the family and perhaps the broader community who are attached to those people. And issues of stress, stigma, and isolation that Hetty was talking about. The burden of providing social support, and prisoner visitation being an example of that Megan was talking about. Chris alluded to the removal of abusive or otherwise or people who have damaging effects on their family, on spouses or parents, as being another mechanism to look at the health of family members. And then we've talked a little bit about mechanisms that might produce racial and ethnic group differences, which is another theme of the conference. Hetty referred to the third burden, the idea of the third burden for black women, and Megan talked about that as well. And then today, one of the big themes has been race differences in the absence of people from data systems and also in loss to follow-up. And yesterday we talked a bit about race differences in the effect of incarceration on neighborhood attainment, where it's actually having a larger effect on whites coming out of prison. But all these, I think, are really critical to understanding how differences in incarceration may translate into disparities in population health. So, and I was going to put this on the next slide, which is things we haven't discussed until Chris mentioned it, and I transferred it back over to here. But also not forgetting to study and to bring into the discussion the health effects on the victims of particularly violent crime or just exposure to violence. That's an important part of the equation as well. So I don't want this to sound too much like criminal justice 101, but I think that when we talk about mechanisms with anything regarding health, we kind of give primacy, for good reason, to a more epidemiological perspective on what those mechanisms might be. But when you talk to people in a criminology or criminal justice world, what they really understand the mechanisms to be are the institutional processes that too many researchers especially don't adequately understand or kind of account for in their research. And I want to end by just highlighting what some of these things are, and especially in the interest of trying to do this kind of cross-disciplinary work I guess in this case, bringing some of the ideas from criminal justice over to the world of public health. I think these are some of the processes and also actors involved in those processes that really are worthy of more consideration and more study, both from quantitative and qualitative perspectives. So we'll start with, as we do in criminal justice, like usually starting with law enforcement and then going through the kind of cycle of a typical a case in the criminal justice system. But police contact, Ernest talked about the stop and frisk laws. It's not just the arrest, but the contact with the police and its effect on the people. And then the decision to make an arrest and what charges should go along initially with that arrest is really critical to understand. Then going into the court system and understanding the role of pretrial detention and whether or not somebody can post bail to avoid pretrial detention. Another critical set of factors, how long people are spending in jail before they even go to trial or get sentenced. The adequacy of legal representation and the role of both the defense attorneys and the prosecutor. The plea bargaining process. The process of pre-sentence investigation, but which is usually a report being written and often a recommendation to the judge being issued, and what goes on in that process. Then the sentencing process itself, which differs across different jurisdictions, but often it involves some kind of determinate sentencing scheme and understanding how quote, objective that is, or how open to bargaining that part of the process is as well. Then we turn to institutional corrections, by which I mean mainly prisons and jails, taking into account the characteristics of the facility itself, how the security level and who people might be coming into contact with, distance from where they were living before prison, or where they might consider home to be, and how difficult that might make prison visitation, and issues of crowding, or just some of the many factors to consider. Also, what kinds of programs are being offered, and what the method is of assigning inmates to programs and sustaining participation. we talked in this last session a bunch about healthcare within prisons, and I think that's another locus for for further investigation. And then what transpires when somebody comes up for parole, and what are the decision about whether to when and whether to release. And then I think it was Alexis talked about the conditions surrounding, somebody talked about this, the conditions surrounding release and the particular difficulty of moving from this very structured world to being kind of dropped out onto the street, sometimes at really odd hours with very few resources. But how much preparation is there for release, and when does it happen, and what conditions does it happen under is a critical mechanism. And then finally, actually not finally, there's one more, community corrections. The conditions of supervision, and which can involve things like electronic monitoring, it could involve some kind of institutional placement, it could, the number of times that you have to check in with your parole or probation officer, and home visits that they make and so forth. And also the way that violations get processed is, I mean, our own research is showing does differ highly across different jurisdictions, and understanding what a parole or probation violation means and how that might affect future outcomes is another critical mechanism. We talked about fines and fees, but also post-prison program participation and treatment is another thing to add to that list. And then where people are living and who they're living with and how long they're staying in those conditions, and both the neighborhoods and the household factors. And then finally, and this is something that Sean Bushway often reminds the criminological world of in his work, that it doesn't just stop with those institutions that we typically think of as being part of the criminal justice system, but the legislative process is also a really critical context for understanding the effects of incarceration. What's criminalized? What kinds of sentencing guidelines get written up in different states and how they're maintained over time? And then finally, also, but the process of setting budgets and of determining how much of that is going to, like, whether the state is going to make a concerted effort to stop the growth of incarceration or provide more services. And I think what I'd like to, I mean, this sounds like this is a daunting list, but I think what I'm trying to get across is not only how complex the process is and how important it is to study it, but also that the actors involved in each one of these steps, and some of you have been bringing that into your research already, are really important people to study in connection with this. And it's not always the case that the people working within the criminal justice system are either thoughtless or mean-spirited in terms of what they want to see, in terms of the health and well-being of the people they're supervising. And I think it's really important to engage with that community as well, and to better understand how they're making their decisions, and hopefully have influence when you bring evidence-based. Or the whole idea of evidence-based practice is, bringing evidence to the decision makers and trying to help change the way that those processes are working. So that's a really idealistic and maybe naively optimistic note to end on. But I won't keep you any longer. I just want to once again thank everybody for the fabulous participation. And I think that any conference is really only as good as the interactions that take place either during the Q&A or between sessions and after sessions. And I think on that mark, from everything that I've been a part of or heard other people talking about, this conference has really been a great success, and I hope it stimulates further partnerships and further collaborations going forward. Thanks again to everybody who participated and organized. Thanks.